Welcome to the chaos sector. We return to the matrix. So let's go ahead and present a theory that some may have concluded about this case. I know it may seem offensive to some, but the truth is what matters, not an emotional connection. We do not attach ourselves emotionally to our investigations. And to be honest, that's how it should be. Actually, investigators do not do this neither. You understand? And what would be the reason for this, you ask? It can cloud your judgment. If your judgment is clouded, you can be deceived, misinformed, overlook something, forget something, or flat out lose your way. Now, the first issue with this theory is many would see it as disrespectful to those college students, also the friends and families who have lost loved ones. Understandable. But you also have to factor in the reason a psychological operation is carried out in the first place, to create such an emotional and psychological reaction to that operation. The mainstream media reports that 4 college students were discovered deceased in their home. Tons of photos are then dumped out there. TikTok videos, smiles, and fun. And you emotionally connect to these individuals immediately. A lone killer is arrested. He's all over the national headlines. A creep who took those precious lives away. But an investigation, such as within the true crime community, does the digging into the case. And this is where the brainstorming takes place. Let's point out a few issues. For one, there hasn't been any surveillance footage released of the suspect. In all cases, when there is surveillance footage of the suspect captured, it is released to the mainstream media. In 2 years, no footage from the next-door neighbor's security camera has been released. Not even the surveillance footage from the gas station has been released. No footage from the Albertsons grocery store, which they claimed Kohberger visited later Sunday after the murders, has been released. We're not including the Linda Lane surveillance because it's garbage. Yet the authorities, yes, the authorities released body cam footage of Kohberger prior to the murders and after the murders. If you're releasing video of the suspect to the mainstream media, then doesn't this mean you want the public to identify, or better yet, confirm that this individual may be the killer? But if this is the reason in which you want to notify the public about this suspect, then why hasn't the next door neighbor's security camera been released? If he is the killer, that camera captured him entering and exiting the neighborhood at the time of the murders. Why hasn't the surveillance from Albertsons been released, which was literally hours later the same day after the murders? This doesn't add up whatsoever. And as we broke down in the previous series, it indicated that Kohberger was never there and didn't know those college students, a framed job, right? But as investigators, you keep expanding your perspective, and it also indicates that it could be a psychological operation. Focusing on Kohberger, either he was framed or it was a psychological operation. But even within the psychological operation, the script has been altered as well, where within that reality there is more evidence that Kohberger had been framed within the psychological operation. You understand? So the trial is being altered based on what true crime investigators, commentators, and other interested groups have done by presenting the logical evidence Kohberger was framed. Understand, the psychological operation is to manipulate and persuade the public, right? But if the public questions what has been presented as the truth or facts about the individual depicted as the killer within the psychological operation, that operation is at risk of crumbling before their feet. So, in other words, the psychological plot was to convince the public Kohberger was the killer, but not everyone accepted it and started to question it. In the plot, they had to adjust on the fly due to the doubt from the public. Oh, he's a loner, creepy guy who was stalking those pretty girls. Yeah, he's guilty of murder. That's the psychological operative's plot. You see? Not so fast. The impact of that narrative started to fade away when they released Dylan's affidavit. That literally changed the direction of their plot. And things started to crumble as the lack of evidence against Kohberger started to take over. The trial is literally in a limbo state because to carry that trial out, there has to be more evidence presented than the DNA on the knife sheath. Because there is no murder weapon, you see? Without the murder weapon, how can you prove Kohberger used that weapon to stab the victims? You literally can't because you lack the weapon as evidence. And we all know that the murder weapon used on the victims is a conviction hands down. The DNA on the knife sheath had already been challenged by and Taylor. Or better yet, what process did the prosecution use to obtain that DNA? Of course, the genealogy expert testified, explained the various loopholes, and soon after she was visited by none other than the FBI. There is no evidence against Kohberger, including the alleged DNA on the knife sheath. But within the psychological operation, The defense is not calling frame based on challenging the prosecution to present surveillance footage from the next door camera. You see, if the defense will demand the prosecution to present that surveillance footage, it would not show Kohberger's vehicle. And without that vehicle physically there during the time frame of the murders, well, Kohberger wasn't there. As you know, that's why the preliminary hearing subpoena was quashed, would not only bring about Bethany's testimony, which her lawyers were paid off to convince her to reject it, but also this process was to allow the defense a chance to review the alleged evidence against the client. This would be the surveillance footage from the next door neighbor's camera, which would identify his vehicle front and back during the time of the murders, including the DNA. After all, isn't this the same security camera footage the FBI expert identified a 2011 to 2013 white Hyundai Elantra? You see? Yes, of course, the wrong year proves it was a frame, but we're expanding that proof into the theory that this frame has become reality within the psychological operation as well. Are you able to stay on this level? I think so. And as we broke down, without Kohberger's vehicle physically there during the time frame of the murders, which prove he wasn't there, then the DNA discovered on the knife sheath is obsolete. In fact, even if Kohberger's DNA was on that knife sheath, you can't physically prove he was there the night of the murders, due to his vehicle never being there during the time frame of the murders. This is the limbo state of the trial that is flying under the radar. And Taylor is alluding to a lot, challenging certain aspects, but the surveillance footage from the next door neighbor's camera is the determining factor. And if Kohberger was guilty, that footage would have been released soon after he was arrested. So in this theory of it being a psychological operation, Kohberger has been framed, which has become the common theory in the true crime community. Yet this has caused a limbo state for the trial as well. You understand? Oh, okay. Did we get too deep into the reality of it being a psychological operation? Perhaps. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would agree with that assessment. And honestly, I don't think it's something many dismiss, but of course it's a sensitive issue. At some point, though, things start to reach a state of doubt, a gradual progression of doubt here, where initially one may have believed Kohberger was the killer, then they believed he was framed, then, well, they believe the murders never happened to begin with. It's how the brain works when you're using critical thinking skills. We initially didn't assume Kohberger was the killer. We came into the investigation collecting the information about the murders. Almost immediately, it appeared to be a multi-perpetrator murder case, based on the setting in the home, how many victims there were, and the accounts of Dylan. Of course, we established a theory that Kohberger was being framed. Yet, we did present the possibility that Kohberger was the DoorDash driver, or he was possibly an undercover collecting evidence regarding drug trafficking. You know, we went through various possibilities to ensure that we turned over each stone before reaching a conclusion. We even acknowledged the possibility that Kohberger was involved with Bethany, although it wasn't a theory we strongly acknowledged. The point here is throughout our investigation, which we've made mistakes in, the conclusion was Kohberger had been framed for those murders. And it became more evident, due to the malicious agenda of the mainstream media, to literally report false claims about this man as fact. They claimed he was in contact with those housemates. They claimed there was, quote, digital evidence that Kohberger had attempted to communicate with Kaylee and Maddie. They claimed there was surveillance footage from months prior of Kohberger in that neighborhood. They even claimed that he had broken into his friend's apartment prior to the murders, with no arrest record, yet was identified as the home invader. Uncanny? And then recently, another report claimed Kohberger was alleged to be involved in a prior home invasion, where a woman physically fought off the intruder who had a knife and wore a ski mask. I mean, all of this had been used to justify the creepy stalker narrative who sought to harm young women in the shadows of the night. All of the so-called law enforcement sources, private investigators, that the mainstream media claimed had this evidence, had that evidence. Nothing had been proven as fact. All to generate guilt before being tried in a court of law. You had Mark Furman, who was snooping around in this case as a private investigator who resided in Idaho, who was a lead detective in another high-profile murder case. And despite what many believed about that case, it was alleged he planted evidence at the crime scene to frame the suspect. His involvement in this case, and his claims about there being a stalker, as he allegedly spoke to several college students to confirm this, screamed frame job. I mean, what are the chances a lead detective was alleged to have planted evidence at a crime scene against a suspect, is involved in another case where the suspect has been framed for murders, where a knife sheath was planted in Maddie's bedroom? It just screams out frame, you know? And then, of course, you have the prosecution, Moscow PD's so-called incompetence, and obviously the FBI's corruption within the investigation. With the lack of transparency, lack of evidence that was presented as collected evidence by the mainstream media, the lack of a motive, the investigation lacked key elements that would justify the arrest and charge against the suspect. And the DNA discovered on a knife sheath was unlawfully obtained on top of that, so there is enough evidence to justify our theory that Koberger had been framed. But because we are not true crime investigators, although some would say we are, and suggest that we focus on them more, well, we focus on truth. And if the truth, being a hard truth to digest for some, is that this was a psychological operation, we have to acknowledge this, even if it's to present this as a possibility. You understand? To seek and obtain truth, there has to be honesty, you see? And I don't really care much in engaging and criticizing others, but the point my colleagues have made is that those individuals are not rooted in honest reporting and investigating. That, my friends, makes it impossible to seek and obtain the truth. If you are in fear of the truth, then you will effectively stray away from the path it lays before you. As the saying goes, the truth hurts. And, well, that's my thoughts.
Well said, and it may not be the take that many want to hear from us, but an investigation is also subject to being investigated itself, you see? Although we're not true crime investigators by definition, it is an area of focus within the chaos sector. Our investigative style is a bit radical, perhaps a bit too brute for some to digest. But this is due to our overall knowledge of deception, corruption, and fighting for the common good. For example, if anyone remembered the Killing Silence series within the Idaho investigation, the reason there was a bit of what many would deem confusion and radical content is because at that point, we were essentially done with the investigation. We concluded Koberger had been framed, Dylan was involved, perhaps with Bonnie and Clyde, in which it was Bonnie who delivered the fake DoorDash to the home. It was clear that this was a targeted attack from within the state of Idaho, with co-conspirators in the state of Washington as well. That was exposed, but stated she agreed to tell the story from one of the next-door neighbors, who feared for her safety, but wanted to get information out there. We examined it, listened to reasons for what they did, and it made sense. But it wasn't only that it made sense, as that's what a neighbor would likely do in such a situation. It was also the accounts of seeing Bonnie and Clyde at the home the next morning, with Dylan and 2 other individuals. Now, the reason all of this adds up is because Dylan's whereabouts were not, I repeat, were not accounted for in the police report, yet everyone else in that home had been. As we pointed out early on in our investigation, this proved that Dylan was a suspect by default, even more so than her inconsistent affidavit. We put the pieces together, presented a theory that Dylan had been outside the home the next morning, with the same people she was in contact with or had accompanied the prior night. And bingo, this is why those whereabouts weren't provided. Now, we put all of the pieces together in the bulk of our investigation to conclude that Koberger had been framed. Dylan was involved in the plot, Bonnie and Clyde were also involved, and the local authorities knew of those murders prior to when the reported 911 call went out, including the college students as well, as we pointed out that Kaylee's friend, Katie, had stated she attempted to contact Kaylee approximately at 10 a.m. to see if she was okay. This is before the 12 p.m. 911 call. So those peers knew about the deaths prior to that call. Well, obviously. But what it established is that the earlier they knew about it, perhaps as early as the wee hours of the morning, there is no question the authorities had been notified also. And all of this leads to what? A cover-up. We also mentioned a similar, so-called murder mystery, which wasn't a mystery when we delved into the investigation. Almost the same setting when it comes to the parties involved. The Kanika Jenkins case, which we ended that investigation with a balanced perspective. Either it was a psychological operation, or the family was involved in her death. The lies the peers told, the horrible edited surveillance footage, and the party footage itself, indicated that Kanika had been set up, and was assaulted, escorted to a kitchen freezer, and locked inside and froze to death. When the mainstream media presented the story, everyone of course reacted in shock. But then as time progressed, and the true crime community and the chaos started to thoroughly investigate that case, it was clear that Kanika had been murdered, as opposed to it being ruled an accidental death. Her peers conspired against her, the hotel covered it up, Rosemont PD covered it up, and the family knew what had happened. We broke all of it down, of course. Yet in our journey through that investigation, it became quite logical that it was a psychological operation. We've never dismissed Kanika Jenkins and made light of the case, as there were many who insulted her, called her promiscuous. She got what she deserved, saying it was her fault she got so drunk, a bunch of nonsense. Just horrible people, you know? And this is why we confronted the clown in recent videos, because he's making a mockery of the case. Think about it. Would he be confident to make such content if he had an audience who upheld investigative standards and integrity? Of course not. But despite our growing belief that the Kanika Jenkins case may have not been real, we presented that theory with integrity, but more importantly, honesty. So, the same concept applies with the Idaho 4 case at this point. Some may not understand the psychological element of an investigation. A true crime investigator essentially is a psychologist because you're examining human behavior, mainly criminal behavior. So understanding the why, the when, the how, the who is psychological protocol in reaching a conclusion. Hopefully, everyone understands. There comes a time when evidence of truth compels you to accept it despite how you may feel.
And we have to also keep in mind that if a psychological operation had been carried out, it also manipulated true crime investigators who dedicated time and effort into investigating. Perhaps months, even years of researching, collecting information, evidence, weeding through news media reports, articles, social media sources. A lot of work goes into an investigation. Many spend hours at a time, glued to their monitors, researching, putting pieces together, presenting their theories or hypotheses to the public. And again, this is why certain individuals are called out, because they insult the hard work and dedication many have. Sure, some would say, oh, they've done great work as well. You can't manipulate someone without the element of manipulation, right? On a side note, many who leave negative comments should take some time to think about this, This is not some run-of-the-mill content just thrown out there for a quick fix. It's hard work, and we respect all genuine true crime investigators, commentators, and anyone else who genuinely address the societal issues. An investigation requires dedication, because you are essentially classified as detectives on social media. Some try to discredit that, even from mainstream media, right? But you are doing exactly what law enforcement agencies are doing, or in this specific case, should have been doing, as we all have pointed out. The irony. Well, I think it's safe to say that we've officially expanded the perception of this case to many now. That's fine, nothing wrong with exercising your critical thinking skills. Once again, though, the truth is what our objective has always been to reveal, and that objective existed before this case, and will definitely exist after this case. To all those who support the chaos, we appreciate it sincerely. Hope to see you all in 2025 for another chapter in the chaos sector. This is the chaos sector.